She signed for the salmon with a practiced calm, fingers shaping the brief, exact markers she had learned to make invisible to strangers. An index finger that skimmed the table like the tail of a pen, a thumb that pressed lightly against her palm to indicate delicious. Mrs. Blackwood laughed without sound, her face folding into the soft, experienced amusement of someone who had eaten in the same corner of Manhattan for decades. The restaurant around them was a study in light and restraint. Candles like small judgments, a chandelier that pooled gold on the marble, servers moving in a choreographed hush. Anna Martinez balanced the tray with one hand and folded herself into the role she had been wearing for 3 years, invisible, courteous, translating another woman's life into gestures that belonged only to them. If you love slow-burn stories of justice and second chances, stay until the end. Like, subscribe, and share. This one's for anyone who's ever had their work stolen and their name taken. Thank you. The first time Marcus Blackwood saw Anna, he thought she might be one of those rare people who knew how to disappear without looking afraid. He was across the room with his mother and an associate, the table near the window that made it easy to watch Midtown shrink into toy lights. He noticed how Anna's shoulders were always aligned to someone else, the patient angle of attention that tells a person how to care without asking. He watched her translate Mrs. Blackwood's grin, watched the old woman touch Anna's wrist briefly as if to confirm that the person who understood her was real. Anna felt the glance like a current. She kept her eyes level. It was practice to not read the way rich men looked at waitresses, curiosity frayed by class lines, and assessment of utility followed by indifference. She had learned to make that look slide off like rain from a waxed coat. But the look did not pass. Marcus's face, under the cut of his hair and the tilt of his chin, held a steadier thing, a tension that could be mistaken for kindness. Mrs. Blackwood's fingers tightened on Anna's hand in an approving squeeze. She signed, "He watches like he reads a book," and Anna gave the translation out loud, careful and soft. Marcus smiled then, not at his mother, but at the exchange, as if the sight of someone reading another person was itself rare and beautiful. After dinner, when the staff had cleared the cloth and the hum of cutlery resumed its metropolitan rhythm, Marcus asked to speak with Anna. He asked gently. He said he owed his mother a favor and would be grateful if she joined them for coffee sometime to keep the old woman company. Anna said no at first. Rules, the night shift, the thin cash flow that meant a schedule couldn't be shifted on a whim. Marcus laughed, slightly surprised, then pressed a small card across the table. "When you have a minute." It said in his neat italic, followed by a direct number. She took the card like a handoff of a heavy thing. Her fingers closed around it, and for a fraction of a beat she allowed the light to catch on Marcus's ring and imagine a life where such gestures were gestures of invitation rather than exposure. That night in her Queen's studio, the city pressed in at the windows like a question. Her apartment was a study in deliberate economy. A single lamp that threw the bed into a rectangle of orange, a battered laptop whose keyboard bore the faint grease of years of notes, a sewing basket that had once belonged to her grandmother and now kept receipts and a small lockbox. She kept the lockbox under the mattress, where no landlord, no date, no surprise visitor would think to search. Inside it were 3 things that were both precious and hazardous: a sheaf of hand-scrawled notes in a mixture of Spanish and English, a battered thumb drive with a single encrypted folder, and a certificate, a provisional claim she had filed the summer after leaving Columbia, before anyone had stolen the lines she'd written into code. She ran a hand over the small certificate until the curl of edge was only texture. Memory threatened to turn bright. She remembered a professor at Columbia who had said, "Language is ownership," and she had meant that. She had tried to own her language by inventing a device that translated intention into text. Someone had taken it and called it theirs. They had been able to call the press and the courts and the signatures that made a claim appear like a rope someone else had thrown over her neck. She had learned to speak in rooms without saying whose work had baked the bread. The next morning, Marcus's voicemail arrived like a weather forecast. His voice was measured, the cadence of someone practiced at announcing acquisitions and outcomes. There was a hesitation near the end, an unfamiliar human uncertainty. "My mother's enjoyed your company," he said. "If you ever want, if you need anything, call. Also, there's something you might want to know. Pinnacle's closing a partnership with a firm led by David Chen. We're doing final due diligence next week. If there's anything that could affect that, please come by. I don't want anyone to be blindsided." He ended with a softer, private invitation. "Lunch, perhaps, noon on Tuesday. Bring whatever you have." Anna listened twice, then 3 times. The words dissolved into a new shape, a risk. David Chen. The name landed like a stone in the shallow pool of the life she had built to avoid ripples. For a long moment, she watched the reflection on the laptop screen and saw a woman she almost didn't recognize. Hair caught at the nape, a face that hardened at the edges where fear had been practiced into stamina. She had no plan to go to noon. Exposure had a geometry. Anna had learned. One bad day could become a cascade, a rumor, a suit, a life unearthed. David's firm partnered with Pinnacle, Pinnacle with Blackwood Holdings. That meant a network. That meant people with lawyers who liked tidy stories. That morning, when she logged into a private account to check the status of the encrypted folder, the top of her feed carried something else. A short clip that had been uploaded overnight. It was 3 years old. She recognized the jacket she had been wearing the day the police had come to her then-employer's loft studio, and the way a bind of notes had hung out of her bag. In the clip, a woman in a dark suit, she could not see the face clearly, yelled across a small tech demo floor. "Security," the video clipped, "you're fired." The image blurred. The title below was blunt, "Waitress fired for theft." Comments scrolled like tide foam. Someone had circled and tagged a corporate account. Someone had attached a headline. The clip had been framed as a morality play. A small woman caught taking from those above her. Anna's chest tightened. The clip was harmless in its blur, but deadly in its implication. There would be viewers who would see a sweaty jacket and assume guilt. She could feel the old humiliation rise like bile. She closed the laptop and put her face against the coolness of her forearm. Mrs. Blackwood's hand in the restaurant returned to her mind like proof of a different life, of a tension that refused to consume. Marcus's voice repeated in the pocket of her memory. "If there's anything that could affect that, please come by." She considered for a long time not answering. Then she opened a new email, typed a line she had rehearsed for months into drafts, and deleted it. Instead, she texted Marcus once. "Thank you for dinner. I translated for your mother." He replied with a single line. "Glad. See you Tuesday?" It was routine. Ordinarily, she would have let it go. But the clip's title had been specific, public, and the same feed had begun to bubble with a thread that mentioned Pinnacle and an upcoming merger. One user had posted a screen grab that included a list of firms, and a casual scroll through led to a footnote naming David Chen as an executive at a smaller startup that had recently been absorbed. Later, when she walked the few blocks to the subway, the winter sun cut a line of hard white across the pavement and left the rest in shadow. She kept her hands in her coat pockets like a person who walked a long road with a map that required both heat and cold to be legible. The idea of going to lunch at noon sat like a pebble against the inside of her jaw. She could bring nothing. Bringing anything kept her close enough to a trail. The lockbox remained untouched under the mattress. The thumb drive would stay glued to the adhesive tape she had used to obscure the label. At noon on Tuesday, she still went. Marcus's office sat in a thin slice of glass that watched the city like a spectator. He was already there, standing with his back to the window, the afternoon like a bright accusation behind him. He did not look like a man who had been waiting. He looked like a person who had stood at that pane often and thought about temperatures. When Anna stepped into the space, the air felt optically cleaner. He came to her with the ease of someone who could fill a room without crowding it. They spoke first of small things, Mrs. Blackwood's favorite restaurants, the difficulty of Manhattan chairs for old hips, the way a winter light makes the East River appear more honest. Then Marcus steered the conversation with the delicacy of a man who had practiced discretion. "I did a little background," he said finally. "Corporate housekeeping. It's my job to ask questions that feel awkward. I'm not going to ask you to tell me your life story, Anna, but I need to know if there's anything tied to Pinnacle or to David Chen you want me to hear before the deal moves forward. This is that window." He said the names like they were levers in a machine. Anna watched the plane of his mouth, the way it tightened when he laid out the possibility that the deal could be compromised by reputational risk. She liked that his teeth straightened for a moment in consternation and that he used the distant legal language of due diligence like a shield. When she told him, quietly, that she had once had work taken from her and that there were papers she had once filed and lost in a series of signatures and reassigned credits, Marcus's face altered from curiosity to a kind of professional alert. He said two small things that mattered. He believed that an injustice that had been done to an employee should be examined, and he would not, could not, let a merger proceed without knowing whose property was at stake. He called his legal advisor, Charles Morrison, from the office's line and set a meeting for the next day. He did not promise outcomes. He promised only that he would check. His eyes, which had at first been simply watching, now held something like accusation toward the world that had let theft pass as acquisition. Anna left with the residue of the office like perfume on a shirt. The day was a cross of warm sidewalk and cold news feeds. She stepped into a cafe to call an old friend, someone who had known her before the theft. The friend listened and then asked bluntly, "Has anything been uploaded?" Anna swallowed. "There's a clip," she admitted, 3 years old. "It shows me being fired." Her friend cursed softly and then said, "You should at least get what you have in order. Metadata, dates, anything that shows you wrote the first drafts." Anna closed her eyes. The idea of metadata made her think of invisible ink, something that shows under attention, not to be used as a tool for harm. She had the one thumb drive. She had the provisional certificate. But the more she imagined pulling those things into the light, the more she felt the old shame stir like a shadow animal under a door. That night, when she returned to the restaurant, the staff had gossiped in small pockets. Sarah, the head waitress, with a voice like dry paper, pulled Anna aside. "You don't want to go on that mergin noise," she said, low enough that the nearby tables could not pretend not to hear. "The city's small, but the money's smaller when it wants to swallow people." Sarah sipped from a to-go cup, eyes narrowed. "You sure about being around that? These things eat people with good hearts for breakfast." Anna's hands remembered how to sign. She rode for a moment in the safe channel of her fingers. She signed a small joke about city gossip and then stopped herself. Sarah's warning was not an order. It was a clamber of caution. The clip, the mention of David Chen, Marcus's good faith call, everything braided into a new kind of threat. She had learned the geometry of fear. Someone looking, someone recording, a public name attached to private shame. That friction could ignite. Then, 3 days after Marcus's office, a different kind of spark arrived. A post circulated among a small group of former employees of the company that had absorbed Anna's design. The message was short, from an account that used complicated privacy settings and the kind of anonymity that habit gives. "If anyone's ever been screwed by David, please DM. We found an internal draft with her name in the metadata." The message attached a single screenshot, a snapshot of a file header with a date that predated David's claimed authorship. Someone else below it claimed to have a full backup. Anna read the thread with the slow panic of someone watching a ceiling crack. She put her thumb against her lip until the texture faded. A hand landed on her shoulder, the old reflex of someone who notices the moment a person is about to break. It was Mrs. Blackwood, standing behind her with the kind of decisive softness that belonged to people who had lived long enough to know when to place comfort over caution. She signed, "Do not let the small men make you small." And Anna read it aloud, voice barely above the skateboarded scratch of the cafe radio. Marcus appeared from a nearby table, as if he had been waiting for some celestial signal to know when to arrive. He sat and pulled out his phone. "There's been an upload," he said, without preface. "Someone posted footage of a hearing at the studio. It looks like you. It's getting attention because of the merger news. But there's more. Our legal team dug up an archived file that lists your name in the metadata. It's messy, but it's a thread. We can pull it." Anna wanted to refuse, to fold herself back into the invisibility she knew. The thought of public papers brought bile and memory. But the word thread sounded like a ladder. Marcus's hand paused on the table, palm up, a quiet offering. It was an old script she had grown used to reading from men like David, an offered base that became a trap. This one did not look like a trap. He was not asking to be trusted blindly. He offered a place to speak and told her he had lawyers who would look, that he would not go to press, that he would be careful. The phone on the table buzzed. It was an alert that would change the room's temperature. The notification preview read, "Video, Waitress fired at tech launch, uploaded." The clip's title was unadorned. Someone had added a subtitle to the upload that read, in small, furious type, "Truth attached." Anna's stomach folded into the kind of hollow that folds open on memory. Marcus read the preview, and a small hard line settled between his eyebrows. He showed her, quietly, a new thing. A private message thread from a user who had once worked at David's startup. The user had written, "I couldn't let the story stay like that. I uploaded the internal draft the night it came through our server. It had her name in the author field. Take everything with care. This is just the start." There was an attached link, blurred in parts, but enough. Someone else had taken the risk of uploading evidence. The restaurant's candled light, until then cozy and forgiving, felt suddenly like an interrogation lamp. Anna breathed in and out and arranged the world into smaller distances. "Who uploaded it?" she asked quietly. Marcus looked at her with the measure of a man balancing risk and principle. "Someone who wanted the truth on the public record," he said. "That could protect you, or it could make things messier. But it's a piece we didn't have before." For the first time since she had learned to sign for other people's gratitudes, Anna considered the possibility of a truth that could be visible without her needing to shout it into being. The image of the lockbox under the mattress, the thumb drive's encrypted folder, the certificate, these things clustered like tools that might, finally, be used for more than survival. Her hands, habitually closed against the world, relaxed fractionally, as if feeling the contours of a new shape. Outside, in the city's cavern of glass, a light shifted. The uploaded file would be watched, parsed, and argued over. That was how reputations moved now, on lighted screens and in courtrooms. It was new battleground and old law. Anna felt the small, precise tremor that comes just before plunging into water, the sense that something would change the surface, whether with a splash or a... When Marcus stood to go, he left his card with her again, this time pressed to the inside of his jacket like a talisman. He said, quietly, "If you want me in the room when they look at the paper, I'll be there." He hesitated. "You don't have to decide today." She signaled a voluntary, slow smile, one they both knew meant she accepted the offer of accompaniment without yet conceding any obligations. Anna walked home under the city's indifferent stars with the weight of a public file in her pocket and a stranger's kindness warming her coat. The uploaded video circulated through rough channels that night, and by morning the phrase "Waitress fired" had become a breadcrumb trail leading to a file with a blurred author line and the quiet revelation someone had uploaded the truth. The truth, at first, was only a rumor, then a thread, then a document with a date that contradicted a signature. Yet for every person who wanted to lift her, the internet also offered those who would prefer the story tidy. Fame and infamy were twins. Both rewarded narratives that simplified complexity into villain and victim. David Chen's people would not wait long. The day the clip began trending, small, concentrated, dangerous, Anna closed her laptop and sat with the lockbox on her lap. Her hands felt like meaning. She opened it and, for the first time in years, held the pen-scratched notes she had written in the margins of her own life. The next call she received was from Charles Morrison. He did not speak like the lawyers on TV. He spoke like someone who had been in rooms where agreements were made on paper and then remade in the language of courts. "We need to preserve evidence," he said. We need to make noise that benefits you, not noise that will be used against you. His voice was not a command, it was a scaffold. Anna sat back and let the words find her. Outside, snow began to fall in small pinpricks, half melting on the city's shoulders. Inside, Anna arranged the small objects of ownership across her table. A certificate, a thumb drive, a phone buzzing with news that would make her name visible. She understood, with the exact clarity of someone who had been taught to read the shadow of a hand as a weather sign, that visibility could be a tool for reclaiming what had been taken, but it could also be a blade. That night, she locked the apartment and did not sleep well. In the small hours, she turned the lockbox in her hands and thought about the upload. A risk taken by another for her, kindness without her consent, but with a correct aim. She thought of the hands motif that had followed her since her first classes in linguistics, the ways that hands can both hide a lie and reveal a truth. She thought of Mrs. Blackwood's hands, warm and decisive, and Marcus's palm open in offer. When morning came, an email from Marcus waited that was short and direct. "We have a conference room scheduled at Blackwood Tower. I want Charles there. Bring the originals if you can. No cameras in the room. We move carefully." Anna read it twice, thumb running along the edge of the paper, until the world shrank into a string of small decisions. She thought then of the uploaded clip and of the anonymous person who had decided that truth mattered more than security. In the fold of agency and vulnerability, she felt something unsteady begin to resolve into a plan. Not to burn the men who had wronged her, not to take vengeance, but to insist on her name and the work that bore it. She would walk into the glass conference room and place her hands on paper and insist that someone acknowledge the light she had always been afraid to draw. She pushed the lockbox under her jacket, felt the cold metal against her ribs like a compass, and stepped into the street toward a life where, at last, she might be seen. They led her through the glass throat of Blackwood Tower, as if through a throat, bright, echoing, with the city folded beneath their feet. The elevator smelled faintly of lemon polish and warm machinery. The doors sighed closed, and Anna watched the reflection of her own face shrink and lengthen as the car rose. Marcus kept his hand near the small leather folder he carried. Charles clasped his briefcase with the mechanical calm of someone who had counted the same steps 1,000 times. The conference room looked down on a long swath of rooftops and a river that cut the city in two. Sunlight threaded through the panes and made the table a strip of almost unbearable white. There was a slow, polite bustle already there, laptops open, a man with a leather portfolio balanced on his knee, a woman who tapped her tablet with the rhythm of someone rehearsed. No cameras, as Marcus had said, no phones at the table. Security kept watch at the threshold with a polite, unblinking formality. Anna slid the lockbox onto the table with both hands, metallic sound, like a promise being set down. She had to control the habit of watching for the small, precise tremor again, those moments before a surface breaks. She opened the lid and let the things speak for themselves. The certificate dog-eared at the corners, the thumb drive in its aluminum shell, the pages with her notes, the writing leaning in the margin as if the pen had chased an idea and never caught it. A pressed ticket, the edges softened by time. A small photograph folded twice, the ink blurred by a thumb that had read it often. Charles laid a folder beside her things and tapped the first sheet. "This is the timeline," he said. His voice had that careful, institutional clarity, no flourish, only the arc of facts. Upload received at 23:17, mirror sites at 23:21. Trending spike begins at 01:04. Internal note from Mr. Chen's office, dated the same day as the signature, was created at 15:12 and last edited 3 minutes after. The file properties show origin from an off-site server. We have a preserved copy. The room inhaled. The man with the leather portfolio, David Chen's representative, Julian Park, leaned forward like a crouched animal. He was younger than Anna expected, with a face trained to be unremarkable until it could be useful. Beside him sat a woman with hair pulled back so tightly it made her eyes look sharper. Evelyn Soto, press handler. She smiled as if smiling were a weapon. "You're certain of the chain?" Julian asked. It was less a question than a calibration of the table's temperature. Charles met his gaze. "We can demonstrate it. We will show you what was uploaded and when. We will show you that the document Mr. Chen produced as justification contains inconsistencies. We will show you the originals." "And yet," Julian said, "documents can be altered. People can create false timestamps. The internet is a theater of forgery. It is easy to confuse a moment of outrage for proof." Anna felt the old, prickling fear, these precise knives of logic that could be made to look like certainty. For a fraction of a second, she imagined the papers being toyed with, captions rearranged. She pictured hands that could pass objects like sleight of hand. Then she thought of the pen-scratched notes, of the way her own margins held an index of days, of coffee stains where she had once rested her mug while thinking. The lockbox had been under her jacket for the walk. Its cold metal against her ribs had steadied her. She reached, without ceremony, to the page with that small, cramped script written on a January morning 3 years ago. "I will read," she said, and when she spoke, the room receded to the world of ink and breath. She read aloud a paragraph from those notes, not something meant for the public, not a crafted speech, only the sly, private sentence she had written and then underlined twice. Her voice was small but steady. The words were not remarkable on their own. What mattered was the cadence, the unique tilt of her letters where she habitually hooked the lower loop of her G's. It was a mannerism of the hand, a fingerprint. Julian's eyes narrowed at the sound of it. Evelyn's hand contracted around the edge of her tablet. Marcus watched Anna with an expression that mixed something like pride with a warding tenderness, an urge to stand in the space between her and the world. Charles closed his own fingers over a page, and when Anna looked at him, he said simply, "We sent this page to an independent document examiner last night. We have their preliminary observation. Handwriting has traits that resist replication. You made a mark on these pages that belongs to you." A small murmur. The man with the leather portfolio exhaled and pushed a printout forward, as if to block the effect. It was a copy of Mr. Chen's justification, an internal memo invoking policy, alleging gross misconduct. The signature line bore a date that contradicted Anna's margin notes. Julian slid it toward her. "We can produce a signed lease," he said. "We can show that at that date the paperwork was filed in accordance with company procedure." Charles picked up the memo with 2 fingers, like handling something brittle. "And yet," he said, "the log we have indicates the official record was altered after the fact. We have server timestamps at conflict with the printed date. We're not going to litigate the internet forensics at this table. We are, however, prepared to preserve evidence and to notify the appropriate authorities if anything is suppressed." Evelyn smiled again, but the smile had begun to fray. "Miss Carter," she said, using Anna's name as if testing the sound, "this is a matter that will be handled internally. There are channels for appeal. There are processes. You can find remedy without making a spectacle." "Remedy?" Anna repeated, tasting the word. It had been offered her once before in the form of a quiet check and a non-disclosure. She had been young and cold then. She had taken a small sum and a silence that felt like a bandage. This morning, with the upload alive in the world, remedy looked different. It was not money she wanted. A check would be paper. The paper she wanted to set down on the table now was her name. "I don't want your standard remedy," she said. The words were cleaner than she expected. "I want my authorship restored. I want credit where credit is due. I want the record to show what happened, not a tidy sentence that erases the work that bore my signature." Marcus's hand found hers under the table, giving the faint pressure of an anchor. Anna let the strength of it run up her arm like current. It kept her voice steady. Julian leaned back, calculating. "A name can be restored," he said. "A public correction can be issued. But the question is whether Mr. Chen's team will acknowledge wrongdoing. If we concede on public credit alone, we risk opening other claims. So make the claim, Charles said. If the alternative is to make quiet amends, then the right thing will be concealed and repeated. And if there is no wrongdoing? Evelyn asked. Her tone was practiced. It was the voice of someone who had spun narratives into calm. If the documents we have are legitimate and your evidence is incomplete? Anna had imagined that question. She reached to the thumb drive in the lockbox and set it on the table like a small alien coin. This was uploaded by someone who wanted the truth to be visible, she said. It forced visibility. I'm not responsible for how it reached the light. I'm responsible for what the light shows. The room waited. Outside, the city squared itself against the glass. Traffic, a gull that krilled the air. Marcus cleared his throat. We propose a short, verifiable process, he said. Immediate preservation of evidence. An independent examiner appointed by mutual consent. A closed review meeting scheduled within 72 hours, with representatives who can either validate the record or authorize correction. Any attempt to hide or suppress will be noted in a public statement. 72 hours, Julian repeated. He tasted the number like a negotiator tasting a counteroffer. That's a narrow window. A public window, Charles answered. Yes, because once the public has seen the upload, silence becomes a statement. Either you provide an explanation or you allow a narrative to form in the absence of one. Evelyn's fingers drummed against the tablet. And if we refuse? She asked, trying to recover the upper hand. Anna looked at them with the clarity of someone who had learned, through marginal notes and lockbox turns, what she could hold. Then I will not be silent, she said. I will take my evidence to every forum available. I will name what was taken. I will ask for acknowledgement and restitution, not to punish, but to set the record straight. The table hummed with the kind of calculation that always followed a moral choice transformed into policy. Julian's jaw worked. Finally, he said, My client will decide. We will respond within 24 hours. If you want an independent examiner, propose a name. We will consider it. But understand, if this becomes a public spectacle, both parties will be harmed. Then prefer truth over harm, Charles said. We will submit a list of examiners. We will preserve chain of custody. We ask for a written commitment that nothing will be destroyed, altered, or removed. There was a long, uncomfortably polite silence. Anna felt the pressure of all those possible futures, each one a sheet of paper folded differently. She imagined the town of her life having yet another fold that might reveal a new line of text. She set her palm flat on the margin page again, felt the warmth of her own hand over the ink. It was a small, private ritual of ownership. Mrs. Blackwood's name had hovered near her in the dark months before this day like a lantern not yet lit. Now, Marcus reached into his folder and produced a letter, short, with a hand she recognized instantly for its bold, efficient loops. We received this morning, Marcus said, from Mrs. Blackwood. She offers to serve as a character witness, and she affirms the timeline of Anna's contributions. At the mention of Mrs. Blackwood, the room shifted. For Anna, the name conjured the taste of strong tea and sharper direction. It was more than a memory. Mrs. Blackwood had been a figure of authority who had once put a hand on Anna's elbow in a crowded kitchen and said, "Your name matters." The letter expressed that same sentiment in ink. It did not solve the case, but it was not nothing. Julian let his eyes travel over the page and then away. Mrs. Blackwood's testimony will be considered, he conceded, as if naming it gave it weight, and yet left the scales in balance. We will not be the first to dismiss a witness. They did not settle everything in that glass room. There were too many motions in law and public reaction for a single meeting to finish. But they set frameworks, preservation orders, a short list of independent examiners, an agreement, on paper, to avoid unnecessary destruction of evidence. They did not agree on words for a public statement. Evelyn promised a measured response. Charles demanded candor. When the meeting ended, Anna felt both drained and buoyant. The city outside the windows seemed less decorative and more territorial, something to be navigated rather than admired. Lines of light cut across the table as if to write invisible margins on the day. As they stepped out of the conference room, Julian paused at the threshold and looked back with a politeness that was almost curiosity. "Miss Carter," he said, "be careful with the spectacle. Headlines are brittle." Anna turned, and in that small movement she recognized who she was not, the one who had once taken a check for silence. She thought of the anonymous uploader, somebody who had gambled on visibility to force accountability, and felt a complicated gratitude. The world could be cruel and also precise. Sometimes a single, well-placed ripple could rearrange a surface enough to show what lay beneath. On the sidewalk beneath Blackwood Tower, snow had begun again, light like ash. Marcus offered to walk her to the transit. Charles had matters to arrange. Anna tucked the lockbox closer to herself and let the cold seep briefly into her fingers. She did not know how long the quarrel would last. She knew only that the decision to ask for her name back had left a space in her chest that felt like a made thing, an empty chair that might one day be filled. That night, the internet carried the conference's bare facts like a current under the city's skin. The clip that had started the chain still circulated, threaded and reframed. Different commentators pulled different corners of the fabric. Some wanted to make the story tidy and divisive, a victim and a villain. Others wanted complexity, or to protect a particular truth for their own reasons. Anna watched the headlines with a futurist's detachment and a historian's hunger, noting not the noise, but the seams. She returned to her apartment and placed the lockbox on the kitchen table, as if it were altar and archive both. She made herself a cup of tea, because the world was cold in a way that did not obey the thermostat. Marcus sent a brief text, "Stay put. Don't talk to strangers." Charles sent a longer note with names and timestamps and a midday appointment for a preliminary review. Anna took the margin page out and smoothed it on the table. Her handwriting, when she looked at it in the lamplight, felt like an instrument she had used to mark the lengths of her days. She read the words again, whispering lines aloud that had once been private. The apartment listened. There were small sounds, the fridge's heart-rending hum, a truck's distant braking, the faint murmur of the building's pipes. Outside, the city breathed in and out. When she went to bed, she dragged the lockbox under the pillow like a talisman, no longer metal against webs, but a warmed thing. For the first time in a long time, the tremor in her that came before a surface broke had been met with a decision. The surface had been broken, perhaps into ripples, perhaps into a single clear slash. She could not tell which. In the morning, the city had new headlines. There was a short, sharp email from an address she did not recognize, one that contained a single line, "We need to talk." The sender name was anonymous, the message bore no signature. It contained, however, an attachment so small it might have been left by mistake. A single image file with the same grainy quality as the original upload, showing a different angle of the incident, one that altered a detail in the picture. A slippered foot turned in a way that suggested the possibility of rehearsal, or perhaps of misinterpretation. Anna sat with that little file and felt the old tremor again. But this time it did not announce a plunge. It announced the possible work ahead, verification, challenge, the slow, meticulous labor of mapping what had occurred against what had been claimed. She put the image in a folder, labeled it, and pushed it into the lockbox next to her margin notes. Names would be called. Examiners would write. Mr. Chen's team would sharpen their arguments. Julian's polite eyes would look to find leverage. But beneath all the maneuvering, there remained a simpler fact. She had placed her hand on paper and had asked, in the steady voice she had found at the table, to have her name returned. That small insistence felt like a hinge. It did not guarantee outcome, only trajectory. Outside her window, the snow kept falling, layering itself over the city like soft amendments. In the distance, sirens threaded the day as always. Anna dressed and made the walk to the transit with the lockbox heavy against her coat. She kept her steps measured. She kept her hands aware of the weight of the metal and of the words that had begun to move. On the train, she watched people reading their screens, faces lit by small private lights, and thought of the person who had uploaded the clip. Whoever they were, they had picked a moment to let something into daylight. Sometimes that was enough to change a life. She stepped off at her stop and walked into the narrow, cluttered kitchen of the diner where she worked. The heat was immediate and familiar. It had the comfort of a room that refused to pretend at being anything but ordinary. Her co-workers nodded at her with the cautious curiosity of people who had seen headlines and then had to return to the grind of shifts and orders and the small economies of tips and smiles. Mrs. Blackwood, when she arrived for the mid-morning rush, came up behind Anna and laid a hand on her shoulder, the same hand that had always felt like a compass. "You did the honest thing," she said, her voice a low rasp. "They will have to answer." Anna watched her smooth the creases of her apron and felt all at once supported and exposed. The day would be long, and there would be customers who argued about small things and others who were gentle. There would be moments of routine that felt like stepping stones. By evening, there was an announcement from David Chen's office, measured, legal-sounding, refusing to admit fault but promising an internal review. The language made some angry and others hopeful. The internet responded with the usual assortment of fury and sympathy, with armchair experts and people who had once been fired themselves and now wanted to tell her what to do. At home, Anna opened the lockbox and took out the margin page. She smoothed it again and, with an absent hand, traced the ink as if it were a map. The margin notes were not proof to everyone. They were not even proof to judges or the press necessarily. But for her, they were a line of continuity. Days when she had written under fluorescent lights, ideas scratched between orders and a shift's grind. The writing bore the texture of her life in a way a signature printed alone on a memo never could. She lay awake that night and thought of hands. Mrs. Blackwood's warm certainty, Marcus's open offer, the anonymous hand that had chosen exposure over a safer silence. Hands, she realized, could be instruments of concealment or instruments of revelation. She slept with that thought as a kind of ballast. When dawn came, there was a message from Marcus. "The examiner you requested has agreed to review. We meet in 2 days. Charles wants to know if you want press there." Anna put down her phone and looked out the window as the city unfurled its morning. The meeting would be a test. There would be more documents, more small strategic decisions, the rough work of forcing a machine to speak true. She was tired, yes, but the fatigue had a different grain now. It tasted like work finally aimed at the right thing. She closed the lockbox, fastened the latch, and took it with her onto the street. Snow clung to her coat. People passed with their own burdens tucked beneath their arms. She walked with them, a person moving through the world, a name she wanted back in the ledger of public things. The path ahead was not small, but for the first time in a long time, she felt the outline of a way forward, as if a hand had traced it for her on a map, and, having traced it, had given her a compass. They would meet again in a room with glass. They would call witnesses and examine margins and argue about what counts as truth. The surface of the story would ripple one way or another. Anna did not know which. But she had learned to carry the small, precise tremor and to set down her hand where it would count. And so she walked toward the day, the lockbox at her side, and the knowledge that she had stood and asked for what was hers, no more, no less. The city moved around her, indifferent and magnificent. and the current of public attention flowed on, ready to be channeled by whoever could make the better case. They met in a room whose walls the city passed through like weather, glass that kept noise at a distance but let light fall in thin and neutral, as if the day itself had stepped aside to watch. Marcus and Charles sat at Anna's left. The examiner, a woman with a careful face and a notebook that looked older than her hands, took the head of the table. On the far side, two men in suits represented the company. Their papers were a quiet mountain. Anna set the lockbox between them and, when the examiner nodded, unlocked it. The margin page lay on the table like a small island. Up close, the ink showed the tremor of a pen held through a shift. The lines were not just markings, but a record of hours and attention. The examiner studied it, then looked at Anna as if asking permission to read the life that had produced the handwriting. They went through facts, dates, locations, who had access to the folders. Marcus supplied a timeline. Charles supplied calm. The company's counsel asked about chain of custody, with a voice practiced enough to make certainty seem inevitable. Anna answered simply, measuredly, naming days and hands and the places where she had laid the page to dry in her own mind before it mattered to anyone else. At one point, the examiner tapped her pen and said, "Tell me how it began. Start anywhere." Anna drew a breath. In the silence that followed, the room seemed to lean forward, waiting for the place where a life became a record and a record might become truth.